There are two things in this world that are more important to me than almost anything: my art and my morals. You see, I'm one of those incredibly annoying people who sees my taste in media as a reflection of myself. I have very high standards for myself as a person, and my taste in fiction reflects those standards. I love stories with intelligent writing, inspiring messages, compassionate characters, stories that change minds and leave a positive impact on the world. However, in this increasingly critical era, it is getting more and more difficult for those stories to hold up under scrutiny. Over the past couple of years, I've seen more and more of my favorite pieces of media be called out for containing or promoting racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and all other manner of social evils. Sometimes the criticism is unfair, other times it's unfortunately justified. But it is always a difficult pill to swallow. And today, I'm going to talk about one of the last series I ever expected to be the target of this kind of controversy. Fullmetal Alchemist is a complex series that deals with some very heavy issues. It has received particular praise for its takedown of military corruption, its nuanced portrayal of the moral dilemmas surrounding genocide and war, and the multifaceted characters on all sides of the conflict. However, recently, discussions surrounding the Ishvalan War subplot of the series have gotten a bit uncomfy. About 2 months ago, the first promotional visuals for the second and third live-action Fullmetal Alchemist movies that literally no one anticipated or asked for were released, and in the midst of all the excitement about new Royai moments and how awesome live-action Ling looked, some fans were very upset about this.
What?
Yes, apparently the people behind these movies thought, gee, wouldn't it be a great idea and totally in the spirit of this series to brownface a character from an oppressed race of people who represents the consequences of racism and corruption? Yes, super smart, totally a sound decision! Understandably, this extremely not okay thing made a lot of FMA fans, particularly fans of color, very angry. And not long after, I started seeing a lot of posts like this, and this, and this. The growing sentiment seemed to be that maybe the Ishvalans were never handled properly to begin with. Maybe, just maybe, Fullmetal Alchemist has always been a little bit racist. For me, Fullmetal Alchemist has always been a happy place. Compared to most popular anime, the fandom is surprisingly drama-free. There's hardly ever any shipping wars, and about the only universally hated thing about the ending is the fact that Roy has a mustache. For the most part, it's so well written that we're just able to geek out about how amazing it is. It's the show that keeps on giving. There's always some genius detail someone is noticing for the first time, or a new project that inspires me to create. But all of a sudden, my love for this series wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a source of guilt. I am not under any illusions about FMA being a flawless piece of fiction, and I know how important it is to have critical conversations about the media you consume. But the Ishval subplot and the characters central to it have always been one of the parts of FMA I've had the most respect for. What does it say about me as a person when the thing I love most about a piece of art may actually be what makes it fundamentally broken? And what exactly am I supposed to do about it? Well, I thought about it a lot, and then I decided I had to make this. In order to process my feelings about this whole situation and hopefully keep my relationship with Fullmetal Alchemist intact, I wanted to make a video fully explaining my perspective on this part of the story. Now, this video is not intended to be me saying, FMA isn't racist, you guys are just mean, wait! The last thing I want to do is come across as condescending or overly defensive or like I'm trying to silence anyone. My goal here is to address some of the arguments I've been seeing lately and point out a few key details that I think are getting forgotten or distorted, as well as to concede a few points where I feel it's warranted. A quick disclaimer, as in my Royai essay, while I have a great deal of appreciation and respect for the 2003 anime, I will primarily be focusing on mangahood in this video, as I am simply more equipped to talk about it, and it also seems to be more so the target of the kind of criticism we're going to be discussing. Also, I didn't feel like going all out on the music and editing like I did for my Royai essay. I really just felt like keeping it simple and just focusing on the discussion. I've been watching a lot of the Authentic Observers videos lately. Go check out Galatea's channel, it's amazing. And I really like her style and format, so I guess I'm going for something kind of similar to that. I realize that at the end of the day, I'm just a nerdy white girl who loves this show enough that she's writing a musical based on it, and my perspective is by no means the most or only valid one. If you have something to add to the conversation or something you think I missed, I would love to talk with you in the comments, but first, hear me out. Being a Royai fan is rough, isn't it? Like, they're both such noble and courageous and fundamentally decent people, and you just love and root for them so much and desperately want them to be happy, but they've also killed thousands of people! Like, how am I supposed to deal with that? Indeed, perhaps no two characters have come under greater fire from this portion of the FMA fandom over the past month than Roy and Riza. And after seeing one too many righteously furious Tumblr posts comparing your two favorite Blorbos to Nazis, it's difficult not to wake up in the morning, see your Roy Mustang action figure, and feel like you have the moral backbone of a chocolate eclair. I understand why some people may find it insulting that a large majority of the FMA fandom is more concerned with whether or not two literal war criminals will tie the knot than with any of the innocent people whose lives they were forced to take. And I also understand why a story that chooses to focus so much on them may be triggering for many. What I cannot excuse, however, is the fact that so many criticisms I see of Roy and Riza's role in the story either twist or completely ignore information that is central to both who these characters are and the world they live in order to suit their biased narrative. And yes, I realize that lots of people on the other extreme do the same thing to Scar, and that's just as bad. But I also think it's possible to care about and empathize with characters on all sides of this conflict and hope for them to eventually achieve redemption. And to reiterate, if you or someone you love has experienced similar trauma to the Ishvalans or have dealt with any sort of prejudice that makes you unable to sympathize with the characters in the Amestrian military, your perspective is completely valid. But if it's possible for you, I think you should at least try. I don't know, I might not be making any sense, but hopefully you get my point. Anyways, moving on. First, let's get this out of the way. I have a big problem with the Nazi comparisons, not just because they make me uncomfortable, but because they're not really accurate. I do understand where they're coming from, but you have to remember that the Holocaust is far from the only genocide, even in recent history, or even the one most similar to the one we see in FMA. Nazis, real ones, have a deeply ingrained belief that their race is superior to all others. Even at their worst, Roy and Riza never believed anything close to this. They joined the military because they believed they were doing so in order to help people, not because they believed all Ishvalans were evil and deserved to die. Yes, it's likely that they and most young soldiers were at some point brainwashed to believe that Amestris's constant military invasions were justified, but it was for defensive rather than ideological reasons. Obviously, what they did was still horrible, but it came from a place of naivete and powerlessness rather than active prejudice. I'm also incredibly frustrated by the amount of people I see criticizing Roy for remaining in the military following Ishval, as if his goal wasn't literally to restructure the military from inside out, to make it so the military's purpose was to serve the people rather than control and hurt them. Like, yes, in an ideal world, Roy would have been able to find a way to combat the military without actually being part of it. But let us not forget that the homunculi had such a chokehold on the military that there was pretty much no alternative that would leave any sort of lasting impact. I'm sorry, but revolutions don't always work, especially when your head of state is borderline invincible and can single-handedly take down a tank. If Les Mis taught me anything, it's that, unfortunately, 90% of the time, Viva la Resistance isn't enough. The way to change is long, hard, and non-linear, and yes, it sometimes requires a lot of doing the wrong things for the right reasons. Speaking of the way to change being long, hard, and non-linear, of course Amestris isn't a democracy yet by the end of Brotherhood! Countries cannot change entire governmental structures overnight, at least not when said governmental structures are meant to be lasting and stable! Roy isn't even Führer yet by the end of the series. He doesn't consider himself ready to be Führer yet because he opted instead to help with the Ishvalan reconstruction and grow as a person before taking charge of an entire country at age 32! One of the more understandable Ishval-oriented criticisms I've seen is, why would the Ishvalans want the help of the Amestrian military in rebuilding their country? Why would they even want to lay eyes on the very same people who slaughtered their countrymen by the thousands? And yes, I totally believe that many Ishvalans would have no sympathy left for Roy, Riza, or anyone else in their position, and I wouldn't judge them a second for it. Heck, Roy and Riza wouldn't judge them for it. They accept the reality that the people's idea of justice may end up meaning they get executed. But I also believe that to say they would all react hostilely is to reduce the Ishvalans to a monolith, to say that they all think the same way. After all, the Ishvalan religion has many parallels to Christianity, and Christianity, in its uncorrupted form, is founded on the principle that anyone who repents for their sins and seeks to put good in the world can be saved. And wouldn't it be worse if Roy and Riza didn't try to help the reconstruction efforts? The Ishvalans are scattered in small groups throughout Amestris, living in hiding and often in extreme poverty. It's unlikely that they'd be able to rebuild an entire country without some outside assistance, and I feel like at least a good portion of Ishvalans would rather accept help from former enemies than allow their culture to die out forever. After seeing all of these criticisms, it's understandable to wonder if Roy even deserves to become Führer. Yes, his goals are noble, but why should he, with all of the blood on his hands, be the one to achieve them? And I admit to a bit of a bias in this answer, as Roy is my favorite character, but I think that anyone who loves this show knows that Roy proved over and over exactly why he deserves to become Führer. This is the man who crawled back from the brink of death with a transmutation circle carved into his hand to protect his subordinates. This is the man who had the strategic brilliance needed to help an innocent woman escape unfair incarceration at the expense of his own reputation. This is the man who, at his darkest moment, was able to humble himself and admit his own moral failings thanks to the integrity and courage of the woman he values more than life itself. The very reason he's able to strive for redemption in the first place. This is the man who, with what little strength he has, will do everything in his power to protect the people he loves. And in turn, they'll protect the ones they love. It's the least we tiny humans can do for each other. If you think Roy Mustang was ever going to quit, was ever going to decide that he'd done too many terrible things to ever be able to make the world a better place, then you don't know him or Riza at all. Because at their core, they are the ones with the drive and courage to look at all of the suffering they have both inflicted and endured and say, no one else will ever have to live like this. No one else will ever have to feel this pain. Not on my watch. With that said, if you still aren't sold, if you still think that I'm just an ignorant weeb who wastes all of her sympathy on the oppressors and can't look at the big picture, I assure you, I'm not finished. Because if there's anyone in this series more misunderstood than the war criminals, it's the focus of my next section. I haven't really talked about Scar very much in any of my previous FMA videos, but over the past few months I've been thinking about him quite a bit. It started when I was tasked with writing a song for him for the musical, and I found exploring his perspective absolutely fascinating. Then, here lately, as he's been at the center of these discussions surrounding Ishval, I've noticed a concerning amount of people missing the point of his character entirely. And ironically, it's resulted in him becoming one of my favorite characters in the series to analyze. The most frequent criticism I see of Scar's character is disillusionment with the fact that FMA's only marginalized major character is a savage, murderous vigilante whose so-called redemption arc hinges on him learning the importance of forgiving his oppressors. Which, yeah, that sounds pretty problematic. If that were the actual point of Scar's character at all. Which it's not. The thing a lot of people don't seem to get about Scar is that he's only framed as a villain for the first third or so of Fullmetal Alchemist because that's how the corrupt imperialist government wants you to see him. He's a red herring meant to distract the audience from the real villain being right under our noses. The evil underbelly of the Amestrian military is not meant to be obvious from the get-go, just like real corruption. It's many episodes and a lot of subtle clues before the curtain is finally pulled and we realize just how foolish we were to believe the propaganda. And even when Scar is framed as a villain, I wouldn't exactly describe him as savage. He has an intimidating presence, yes, but he nonetheless comes across as extremely sane. There's clearly a method and a moral code behind his actions. I've also seen a few people say that FMA portrays the Ishvalans themselves as savage, which, I'm sorry, but I don't think that could be further from the truth. Well, it's true we don't get to see much of the Ishvalans outside of Scar. What we do see of them shows a peaceful, intelligent culture inhabited by undeniably human individuals. We see this in Scar's brother, whose passionate search for the truth within the truth ultimately leads to the salvation of all of Amestris and, by extension, a new birth for his people. We see this in the Ishvalan High Priest's willingness to sacrifice his own life so that his people might be saved. And may I also add that the Ishvalans didn't take their oppression lying down. As shown in the manga, they were able to keep the Amestrians at bay using guerrilla war tactics at least until the state alchemist showed up, and many of them stayed defiant right up to their last breath. And yes, the anime should have done more to show this. You guys are right about that. Arguably the worst take I've seen among the FMA criticals is that Envy is more humanized than Scar, which, I'm sorry, what? Yes, Envy's death is gut-wrenching and sad, but he's still a cruel, sadistic monster who instigated the systemic murder of an entire culture for fun, and the series, thankfully, never makes any efforts to downplay or excuse this. Scenes we see of Scar's past in Backs in the Distance are some of the most tragic and painful in the entire series. We are meant to hate Scar for killing Winry's parents until we find out why. He's just seen his entire family murdered in front of him, and when he sees the rock bells, he has no idea they're trying to help him. All his intensely traumatized mind can see is that they're Amestrians, beautifully symbolized by their blue eyes being the only thing shown in color, and that Amestrians are out to hurt him and the people he loves. As far as he knows, he's acting in self-defense. And then when you see him staggering across the desert until he finally sees the ruins of his destroyed hometown and just lets out this wail of absolute agony, you can't tell me that we as the audience aren't meant to deeply sympathize with this. If this is what glossing over the suffering of victims looks like, I'm terrified to see what it looks like when it isn't. Also, oh my gosh, I just looked at the comments section for this scene on YouTube and I totally get why people of color feel alienated in this fandom now. Some of y'all got no common sense and no clue how trauma works. To me, the message is clear. If Scar is a monster, then it is bigotry and corruption that have made him so, and the fault is fully on the oppressors for their own demise. He is a consequence of genocide, not its justification. I will 100% agree with many FMA critical commentators in that no, Roy doesn't have any moral high ground over Scar. Roy killed innocent people under orders, and Scar killed non-innocent people as a vigilante. Scar's mistake was in blanketing all state alchemists as evil, which obviously Ed and Al are not, but it's still extremely understandable given his circumstances. Scar even gets to have the moral high ground over Roy in one scene where he cautions him against losing himself to his hatred, the very thing he himself had once been consumed by. Ultimately, they're both men of principle whose circumstances have led them to do terrible things, but who choose not to let the worst parts of themselves define them. Which brings me to Scar's character arc. I have a somewhat hot take on this matter. Scar's redemption has nothing whatsoever to do with forgiveness, or trying to prove his culture's worth, or whatever everyone seems to think it's about these days. Never once does he say to Roy, Riza, or any Amestrian that he forgives them. And that's okay. No one in their right mind should expect him to. Scar's redemption arc, I believe, is about growth. It's about him realizing that the path of violence is not the path towards helping his people. I've seen a lot of people criticizing Scar for helping the Amestrians during the climax of the series, but they're forgetting something very important. Ishval is literally part of Amestris too. If Scar doesn't help them, he is willingly signing the death warrant of what few of his people are still alive. And when asked why he's trying to save Amestris, Scar responds with, "I'm not trying to save your country. I'm trying to change it." Does that sound like forgiving your oppressor at all? The series ends with Scar refocusing his efforts towards rebuilding the Ishvalan culture and hopefully bringing his displaced countrymen back home, and that's beautiful. And what's more, it fits perfectly within the themes of the series. Scar initially believes in eye for an eye justice, in other words, equivalent exchange. But by the end, he learns that the way towards the best possible society isn't simply through equivalent exchange, but by everyone giving as much as they can to the world, just like Ed and Al do. It's the exact same lesson. Something else I see brought up rather frequently is the fact that Scar's desire for vengeance is unfairly treated as less justifiable than Roy's against Envy, or Winry's against him. To that, I say, which of these three characters actually fully achieves their vengeance? Not Winry, whose gun is coaxed from her hands by Edward, who tells her that her hands were made for healing and not killing. Not Roy, who nearly loses his humanity and vision in the flames of his wrath and must be talked down by those closest to him before he can deal the final blow. I'm shocked that I don't see this get talked about more often. But Scar wins. Scar gets to finish off the very man responsible for the genocide of his race, the second most prominent antagonist of the entire series. And it's awesome! Scar versus Bradley is easily one of the best and most satisfying battles in the show, and it doesn't carry any of the disturbing point of no return undertones that Roy versus Envy does. Because Scar doesn't just carry anger in his heart in this scene. You can see that he has developed an inner peace from knowing he is fighting for something bigger than himself, fighting for growth and change rather than destruction. Earlier in this section, I said that corruption and bigotry turned Scar into a monster, but ultimately, they really didn't. In the end, Scar was strong enough to not let his pain completely destroy his inherent goodness. His oppressors took so much from him, but they didn't take his heart. And if that isn't a positive message for anyone who's been burned by the system, I don't know what is. Welcome back. The lighting is now cursed. I'm sorry. While I do think Fullmetal Alchemist did so much right in telling this story, there are a few criticisms of it I have to admit I agree with. Firstly, I will say that while I think Scar as an individual is handled really well, I think the feeling of otherness a lot of fans get from him is understandable due to his relationships with the other characters. While his arc is beautifully written, he is still very isolated by the end, which makes sense considering his trauma and completely justified aversion to anyone in the Amestrian military, but I think it would have helped to see some of the other characters making a bit more of an effort to understand him and perhaps questioning themselves a bit in the process. This is something that I do think 2003 does better. You get some really interesting conversations between Ed and Scar that you just don't get in Brotherhood. Suffering and anger are also such dominating elements of Scar's character, and I completely understand where some POC fans would be like, oh, another traumatized person of color. So refreshing. Since the war is so important to the overall story and Scar's single-mindedness is one of his chief character traits, I don't think there's a lot you can do to remedy this in the actual series. But I really do hope that if there's ever some sort of spin-off, we'd get some scenes of Scar healing and being able to define himself outside of his pain. More moments with Meg. This is the case for any Ishvalan characters, really. I understand why we don't get to see them much in the main story, since pretty much all of them are either displaced or dead, but I think that in any future FMA material, we'd all love to get to know more about their culture and see Ishvalans whose arcs aren't defined by overcoming vengeance. I've also seen a couple of people say that they would love to see Ishval regain its independence, and yeah, I'm all for that too. This is pretty much the common theme for this section. FMA is such a complex world with so many different worldviews between its characters that it's really impossible to tie every little thing up without leaving something that makes someone on Tumblr go, hey, That's kinda sus. But I genuinely think that a lot of these issues could definitely be solved or explored further in a spin-off, which is why it really sucks that we're probably never gonna get one, but I digress. For instance, I've seen a lot of people point out the fact that at the end of the series, the people of Amestris believe Furo Bradley died as a hero and don't actually know there are any structural changes going on in their government at all. A lie Roy and his team had to tell in order to make sure their coup went through without any riots. I understand why they did it like this, but I also understand the somewhat uncomfy implications, and I think this would be a really interesting moral dilemma to explore in a spin-off, you know? Figuring out the best way to gradually reveal to the people that military dictatorships are bad. I've seen some criticism directed towards Olivier for her apparent social Darwinism and perceived lack of moral outrage about Ishval, and while I still think Olivier is an awesome character with a lot of integrity, she's also no saint either. And I'd definitely like to see her worldviews challenged or fleshed out a bit more in any future material, and perhaps for her to realize that for all her strength and brilliance, she isn't quite done growing as a person. Lastly, the elephant in the room, the plot point I've seen get the most heat in mangahood, even before all the drama started, is the fact that Roy accepts a philosopher's stone from Dr. Marco at the end of the series to recover his eyesight, and yeah, I can't really find a way around this one. It is a bit messed up when you think about it. There is the fact that there's really no way to unmake the Philosopher's Stone, so it might as well be used, but it definitely should have gone towards helping the Ishvalans instead of one of the people responsible for thousands of their deaths. Yeah. I can really only say that Arakawa may not have fully thought this one through. She probably didn't want to incur the wrath of her fans by leaving Roy blind, and this was the easiest solution. It's important to keep in mind when thinking about this stuff that mangakas have extremely demanding schedules and deadlines no normal human being could possibly meet. So it's pretty much a miracle Fullmetal Alchemist is as well thought out as it is under the circumstances, especially when it came to pretty much everything else about the ending. And I do hate that this is Roy's last scene in Brotherhood. It probably left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths when it comes to his character, which sucks because everything else about him is so well executed. Personally, I don't necessarily think Roy should have stayed blind. I think I would have left it open where there's like a possibility that he'll be able to see again one day, but they haven't found a way yet or just aren't prioritizing it at the moment. This is pretty much how Fiona and I plan on handling it in the musical, and I'm definitely open to addressing some of the other issues I brought up in this section as well. When it comes to things like this, I think you just have to accept that authors aren't perfect, and neither are the characters they create. I still love Fullmetal Alchemist every bit as much as I did before making this video, but I've learned not to put it on a pedestal, which I think was a very important lesson for me to learn since I'm adapting it to a different medium. When you hold up someone's work as the most magnificent, flawless piece of fiction ever to exist, it's hard to believe you have anything you can add to it. But in a way, it's strangely comforting to talk about FMA's imperfections, because that means there's room for us as fans to make it even better than it already is. One of my favorite classic books, To Kill a Mockingbird, has gone through a similar re-examining to Fullmetal Alchemist in recent years, with many criticizing it as undermining people of color in favor of white saviorism, because apparently a white man doing his job and defending his client regardless of his race is indicative of some sort of hero complex. As someone who loves this book, I understand that while it's likely due to the book being from Scout's point of view as well as taking place in the 1930s, the relative lack of development Tom Robinson gets outside of the trial scene may come across as disappointing to a lot of Black readers. And that's okay. If something simply isn't relatable to you or makes you uncomfortable, my taste in media isn't so important that I'm going to judge you for having your own. And if there were to be, say, a mini-series made based on TCAM today, I would hope it would take advantage of the expanded format and flesh Tom and his family out in further detail. But the point I'm trying to make about To Kill a Mockingbird is that nowadays some people will say it's aged poorly due to the fact that most people no longer need to be told that a Black man is every bit as entitled to a defense in court as a white man by a white woman. But to me, the value of this book is deeper than that. I think we should always give due credit to the stories that challenge the status quo, whether or not the status quo has changed in the years since. Mockingbird took courage to write. It said something a lot of people didn't want to hear at the time. It was, in a word, revolutionary. Now, I'm not saying anti-racism is as integral to Fullmetal Alchemist as it is to TCAM. It's not. And FMA should by no means be held up as the end-all be-all perfect portrayal of oppression and genocide in fiction, but I also think it handled these extremely risky topics with a lot of sensitivity and empathy, and never talked down to its audience while doing so. I can't think of any other anime from the same period that touches these topics with anywhere near FMA's level of detail, and about the only one I've seen attempt it since is Attack on Titan. Now, that's not me saying they don't exist, I'm just saying I haven't seen them. A TV series, or manga, especially one like Fullmetal Alchemist, is such a complex endeavor that it's ultimately impossible for it to get everything right. No show is ever going to be perfect, except Ted Lasso. If you don't like Ted Lasso, you have no soul. Sometimes, no matter how compassionately they approach a topic, it will always be just a little off the mark due to the author coming from a place of privilege. But no matter what flaws we pinpoint in our favorite stories in the coming years, I think we should always save a special place in our hearts for the trailblazers. The stories that dared to harness scary emotions and tackle scary ideas with passion and sincerity, even if they didn't stick every landing. Because if authors are too afraid to take risks, then those stories that change minds and leave a positive impact on the world, we won't get them. I still believe Fullmetal Alchemist is one of those stories. Even if it doesn't get everything right, there's so much that it does. And it's paved the way for plenty of series in the future to perhaps do even better. Thanks for watching.